Hey guys, this is Pablo with Meditation Amsterdam, and in today's video I want to elaborate on an analogy that I've thought up today to explain how we move away from the egoic personality and towards pure being. And I will do so partly in answer to a couple of questions that came in through the comments of the video that I made yesterday. And I will read the question first, and then I will use my copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead in order to explain this via an analogy that I think, or I hope, will help clarify the topic. So first I want to read the questions that came in. One of them says, what would you say to the suggestion that the self, or identity, comes to an end and that nothing takes its place? And so the viewer here is asking that because I suggested that our identity first attaches to the egoic sense of self and then it attaches to pure being. But the question here is, can we come to a place, or that's how I interpret it, where our identity attaches to nothing, right? So that's one of the questions. The second question follows a statement that I made towards the end of the video in which I say that pure beingness is impersonal. And so the viewer says, I think there may be a religious claim in this video towards the end that says that being itself is impersonal. Is there not identity and ego in making a claim either way, in saying that pure being is personal or impersonal? Open-mindedness to both sides seems the most empowering and grounded. No? So both very interesting questions, and this topic is very nuanced. So I actually feel quite encouraged by this line of questioning, because it tells me that people are really hot on the trail of what the topic is about. So there's a lot of nuance in those questions. That's very encouraging, actually. And what I thought I'd do is I would explain and tackle both questions at the same time by pretending that the Tibetan Book of the Dead is such a smart book that it has self-awareness, right? So this is a self-aware book all of a sudden. And you could imagine that this copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is self-aware, and it is totally identified with what it is, with its content. So that would be the equivalent of a person being identified with their egoic sense of self. What you can tell from that is that the identification is very narrow and very concrete. So if this copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead was self-aware but very narrowly identified with its egoic self, it would say, well, what I am is this particular copy of this particular translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and because that's what I am, what I see as my purpose, and the way to fulfill my purpose, is for people to read me as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, to place me in their bookshelf, and to brag to their friends about how smug they are, about the fact that they finally found a worthwhile translation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and how edifying that translation is, and to keep me very prominently in that bookshelf. I'm just making this up. So you can see that the book, narrowly defined as exactly that, having self-consciousness, sees itself and its purpose as a very narrow, very well-defined thing that allows to be read and to be bragged about. Okay? Now, say that this book starts to do a little bit of spiritual work, and therefore it broadens its identity. And it says, well, I'm not only that, but I fit in a broader category which is called spiritual books. And now that I see myself as not just that particular translation of TBD, but as a spiritual book, now I also enjoy being compared to books about Christianity and what they have to teach. I want to be compared with books about Hermeticism and so on. So you see that by defining itself in a broader way, the book now feels that it has a broader purpose, and it sees itself being open to a broader exploration of what it is, and finding itself in a more ecumenical or a more varied discussions and new circumstances that open up to the book. And let's take a step further. And it says, well, I'm not just a spiritual book, but I will now become a broader thing. I will now just be a book. And because I see myself as a book, I now belong to a category of things that can be given as a gift, for example, or feature as part of lectures in book clubs. I enjoy having bookmarks squeezed in between my pages, and I enjoy little notes being made on the margins and things of that kind. So what you see now is there is a progression happening between the narrowness or broadness of the identity that the book gives itself, and the breadth of purpose and familiarity and ease with which it can enter new situations. So you can imagine that the Tibetan Book of the Dead, signed by the Dalai Lama, would be found would literally be found dead taking part in a book club lecture because I've been signed by the Dalai Lama and so on. Right? So its narrowness of self-definition or narrowness of identity prevents it from feeling at ease in a book club or being given as a gift. It only sees itself as being read as a very important document and being bragged about in the bookshelf at home. So you see the progression between, or you see the correlation between trying to be special, trying to define ourselves and identify with something narrow, and how that precludes us from feeling safe and familiar in pretty much any circumstance. Now, for the sake of discussion, let's keep making this even more generic. Now, you can go from saying this is a book, from saying that it is a bunch of paper bound together, right? That has become even more generic still. And as paper, this thing can fulfill further purposes, such as having a page ripped off so that you can leave a little message by the door. It can be burned in a cold winter when you have no wood for your fireplace. If we take it even a step further, it's not a book, but it's or paper, but it's an object, right? And as an object, it can be eaten. It can be used to whack somebody in the head with. Its colors can be used to design. A brand identity or to design a new brand of clothing, for example, because these are very inspiring color palette. You see? So now the breadth has become enormous if you define it as an object. And if you go even further and you start to pluck away at the pages and the bindings and the rest of it, the book can says, listen, there's no real bookness to me. This whole idea of a book, it's a composite of pages and content and binding and a cover and some sort of introduction by somebody else or whatever. But if you pull those apart, there's really nothing left of me. So I'm not even an object. I'm nothing. And therefore my identity has now become infinitely large, because as nothing, I can be used to give people paper cuts, but I can also be used as a frisbee. It becomes completely generic. And therefore, its degrees of freedom are also almost infinite. Now, This entire analogy is just so that we understand that the progression from a very narrowly defined egoic identity in which you are so and so, born in such a place, with certain beliefs, certain ways of conducting yourself, things that you are comfortable and not comfortable with, people that you like versus dislike, and the rest of it. It's a very narrowly defined and therefore confined way to identify yourself. And because it's so narrow, it's very easy to pin down. It also consists of things that are not as solid as you would like them to be. And there are an infinite number of circumstances that you are unfamiliar and uncomfortable with. But as you start to chip away at that narrowness and your identity becomes ever more generic, things become way, way safer than that. And you feel it in your bones. So the notion that you can do away with identity altogether is perhaps the end of the path, one in which mind no longer feels the need to attach itself to any particular identity. But on the road there, you may find that your identity becomes more open and more pliable, and the jump from egoic identity to identifying as pure beingness is an enormous jump. Granted, pure beingness is still an identity, and when you drop that, you can then identify or non-identify as being, but also non-being, right? It becomes ever more generic until there's really nothing left to identify with. And so that answers both questions in the sense that, yes, eventually the mechanism of identification is what needs to be dropped so that you don't even need to identify as pure beingness. And it also answers the question of, are we not being dogmatic or religious by saying that pure being is only impersonal but not personal? I would say that pure being is everything and nothing, but at the same time you could say that the personal is more narrow and more defined than the impersonal. So it's pure being can manifest itself as the personal, but the impersonal is broader. Now, pure being contains both, of course, but one of them is more narrow and the other one is broader, much in the way that I tried to explain with the analogy of the book. In fact, those two categories are not even the only categories, right? Pure being could be personal, impersonal, anti-personal, apersonal, semi-personal, sometimes personal, sometimes not, you name it, right? Or both personal and impersonal at the same time, and yet the opposite. So it transcends categorization, and therefore, to be pinned down and saying is this but not that is indeed problematic. Now, when I said pure being is impersonal, in the context of last video, I was trying to indicate that the move from personal identification with ego is further, certainly way, way further from pure being than if you are identifying with the impersonal side of pure being. But to the viewer's credit, they are both statements of fact that break down at some point, as language always does, of course. And so the essential point of this video is one in which the spiritual process can be seen as one in which we chip away at narrowness of definition of what our identity is. And that narrowness, it's in our best interest to abandon it, because it's a very, the degrees of freedom are, they have a negative correlation with that narrowness of definition. And that narrowness creates a great sense of lack of freedom and unsafety, because even the definitions that we choose when we concretize ourselves are very flimsy. They're very easy to challenge and limited in space and time, all of which makes us feel unsafe. Whereas if we choose to be more generic, less special, we find that we feel much more at ease, and that we then can move into different spaces and circumstances without feeling threatened, because the lack of being special grants us huge degrees of freedom, and there's nothing to defend that can be a source of insecurity. Pure being is a great place to park your identity if you've been sitting in egoic identity all your life. But of course, ultimately, the mechanism of identification is the one that needs to be done away with, so that there is just ultimate freedom and safety at the same time. I'm very curious to hear about your comments on this one. Does it resonate? Have you experienced indeed those degrees of freedom as you concretize yourself or open yourself? So do share them in the comment section. And as usual, if you think that this content can be helpful to others, then your liking, sharing, and subscribing makes the channel far more visible, and it's also very motivating. And I'll be back with more videos pretty soon. Until then, cheerio. Thanks for listening, and bye-bye.